All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving into some pretty dense material.
Yeah.
We're looking at the work of Aijaz Ahmad.
Yes.
Specifically, we're looking at his book, In Theory, Nations, Classes, Literatures. This was a request from one of our listeners,
Hmm.
and it's been a journey to kind of get through this and
Yep.
understand it all.
It
I'm
has.
excited to get into it. Um, I guess we should introduce who this guy was because before we started researching for this episode, I'd never even heard of him.
Right.
So, Aijaz Ahmad, can you tell us like who he was, where he came from, what his deal was?
Sure. So he was born in India in 1941.
Okay.
And he ended up kind of becoming this big name in American academia.
Okay.
Became a chancellor's professor at UC Irvine.
Wow.
And but he was a Marxist philosopher, literary theorist, and political commentator. So
Okay.
really fascinating guy.
Yeah, it seems like his work really sits at the intersection of like a lot of different fields. And one of the things that really kind of stuck out to me when we were reading through this was this this tension between his clearly stated Marxist perspective
Right.
and the way that he critiques postcolonial theory.
Yeah, he's definitely coming at it from a different perspective than a lot of other post-colonial theorists.
Right. So I think for this deep dive, what we really want to do is get into what are his main arguments, what are his big criticisms, and why is this stuff that he was writing, back in the late 20th century, why is it still relevant for us today? Why should we care?
Exactly. I think that's a really important point, and I think there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, because I'm hoping we can provide some like aha moments, for our listeners to really kind of get them thinking about the stuff in a different way.
Totally. Yeah, there are definitely some thought-provoking ideas in his work.
Yeah. Okay, so we talked a little bit about who Aijaz Ahmad was, where he came from. Can we maybe talk a little bit more about like what were his core contributions? Like what are the things that he's really known for?
Right. Yeah. So I think one of the big things is his critique of post-colonial theory.
Okay.
And particularly folks like Edward Said and
Yeah.
Homi Papa, who were, these really prominent figures in post-colonial studies.
Oh yeah, these are big names that
Yeah.
we've covered on the show before. So,
Yeah.
what was he saying about these guys? What was he criticizing?
Yeah, so I think his big argument, and this is really kind of laid out in his book In Theory, which was published in 1992, is that post-colonial studies often essentializes cultures,
Okay.
right? And what he means by that is that it treats cultures as these unified kind of static things, and he argues that overlooks the class struggle and the material conditions that are actually shaping these societies.
Right. So it's kind of like saying that I don't know, like all people from India, for example, like have this one unified Indian culture or something,
Yeah.
and it ignores all of the different class differences, all of the different religious differences, and all those kinds of things.
Exactly. Exactly. It's kind of like flattening these really complex and diverse societies into these kind of monolithic entities.
Yeah. Okay. So, how does that then connect to his emphasis on class? Like how does that kind of flow from his critique of post-colonial theory?
Right. Yeah. So a lot of post-colonial theorists were really focusing on things like identity, hybridity, the ways in which colonial discourse like shaped the colonized mind and all that.
Yeah.
And Ahmad is coming in and saying, hold on, like we need to look at who controls the means of production, who benefits from the existing economic system. We need to look at the actual, like, on-the-ground economic realities.
Right. So, it's like less about what's happening up here in the ideas, and
Yeah.
more about what's happening with actual material stuff, right?
Exactly. And he's arguing that's actually the most important factor in shaping societies, not just these kind of cultural discourses.
Right. So he's really materialist. He's really focused on the material conditions.
Right. Yeah, he's very much grounded in that materialist perspective.
Okay, cool. So, I guess one of the big things that we've talked about on the show before in relation to post-colonialism is the concept of nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really complicated thing. It's something that's played a huge role in a lot of different post-colonial contexts.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, like, how did Ahmad approach this concept of nationalism?
So, I mean, you're right. It's a really complex issue, and he definitely didn't approach it in this kind of like simplistic way. He
Yeah.
didn't just dismiss it outright, as some Western thinkers did.
Right.
They just saw it as inherently regressive.
Hmm.
But he also didn't just like celebrate all nationalist movements uncritically,
Right.
which is a tendency you sometimes see in postcolonial studies.
Okay.
So instead, he really insisted that nationalism could only be properly understood through the framework of historical materialism.
Okay.
So, really looking at the specific historical and material conditions that gave rise to particular nationalist movements.
So again, it's kind of like we need to look at the specifics of the situation
Exactly.
rather than making these broad generalizations.
Yeah, yeah. We can't just talk about nationalism as this abstract thing. We
Right.
have to look at, like, what were the economic conditions? What were the political conditions? What were the social conditions that led to this particular nationalist movement?
Yeah, it's all about context. Okay, cool. So we've talked a little bit about his critique of postcolonial theory, his emphasis on class. But I also want to touch on something that came up in the source material, which was his skepticism of Western academia.
Right. Yeah, and this is another really interesting aspect of his work.
Yeah, like what were his issues there?
So, he was really concerned about the tendency, in Western academia to just kind of like take these theoretical frameworks that were developed, in Western historical and social contexts
Mm.
and just kind of like plop them down on the global South,
Okay.
and assume that they're just like universally applicable.
Right, and like without really thinking
Yeah.
about like how they might need to be adjusted or how they might not even be relevant in those contexts.
Exactly, exactly. It's like this like one size fits all approach to theory. And he felt that there was often like a real failure to like actually engage with the unique economic, political, and social histories of non-Western societies.
Right, because it's not like, the rest of the world is just like a blank slate
Mhm.
where you can just kind of like impose these Western ideas onto it, right?
Right, exactly. These societies have their own rich histories, their own complex realities,
Mhm.
their own ways of thinking. And he was particularly critical, I think, of the uncritical adoption of postmodernist theories in these contexts,
Okay.
because he argued that they often like inadvertently obscured or downplayed, the ongoing issues of economic exploitation, political power imbalances, the enduring legacies of colonialism.
Right. So it's kind of like it's almost like this form of like intellectual imperialism.
Yeah, exactly. Like we're not colonizing you physically anymore,
Right.
but we're going to colonize you with our ideas.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So his kind of critical perspective of Western academia, it also, it seems like, extends to his views on literature as well.
Yeah.
And the very idea of like a literary canon, right? Like
Yeah.
what books are considered to be important, what books are taught in schools, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. He really challenges those traditional ways in which literary canons are constructed, and who gets to decide what's important.
Yeah, and whose voices are heard and whose voices are silenced.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And he really advocated for this more inclusive and historically informed approach to thinking about literature.
Okay.
One that explicitly considered the dynamics of class struggle and historical materialism in shaping like literary production.
Right. So he's not just saying, oh, let's just add in like a few more books from different parts of the world to the canon.
Yeah.
He's actually saying we need to like rethink the whole way that we think about literature.
Right. Yeah, it's not just about like adding a few more voices to the mix. It's about like fundamentally changing the criteria for what's considered important.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really important distinction.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So, we talked about Ahmad's background, some of his core contributions, some of his big critiques. Let's dive into his most influential book, In Theory: Nations, Classes, Literatures.
Okay. Yeah.
The source material calls it a seminal critique of postcolonial studies from a Marxist perspective.
It really is. It's a really important book.
Yeah. So can we kind of break down like what's the central argument of this book? Like what is he trying to get at?
Sure. So at its core, in theory, is really this sustained critique of what Ahmad saw as the culturalist and idealist tendencies
Okay.
that were really kind of prominent in Western academia, particularly in the field of postcolonial studies. And he engages with the work of folks like Edward Said and Fredric Jameson, who were, you know, incredibly influential figures.
Hmm.
And he's arguing that while their work is important, their frameworks ultimately fall short because they don't engage enough with materialist and historical analysis.
Okay.
And he's arguing that post-colonial theory, in a lot of its, you know, more dominant forms, tends to kind of homogenize, you know, these diverse historical experiences. It relies on these essentialized notions of culture,
Okay.
and it really neglects the underlying economic and political realities, you know, that shape societies and their cultural expressions.
Okay. So, you know, we talked about Edward Said's Orientalism before.
Right.
You know, which is obviously a very important book, a foundational book in postcolonial studies.
Absolutely, yeah.
Um, and you know, Ahmad, he acknowledges the importance of the book, but he also has some pretty serious critiques of it.
Yeah, he does. He definitely sees it as a really important intervention, but he thinks that it needs to be kind of I guess situated within a broader, you know, framework.
Okay.
And he has some issues with some of the theoretical underpinnings of the book.
Right. So, what are those?
Yeah, so one of his big arguments is that Saad relies too heavily on Foucault's concept of discourse,
Okay.
and that this leads to this kind of deterministic view of colonial knowledge production.
Okay.
Right. So it's like the Orient is just this thing that's constructed by Western discourse.
Okay.
And it kind of ignores the agency, you know, and the diverse responses of the colonized people themselves.
Right. And he's saying that's not historically accurate, right? That it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's saying that it's not this kind of static, unchanging thing. You know, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of, you know, different ways in which people are responding to this colonial discourse.
Okay, cool. So,
Mm-hmm.
what else does he say about Orientalism? Like, what are some of his other critiques?
Well, he also argues that Said's analysis kind of creates this monolithic West and East binary.
Right.
Right. And by focusing so much on this kind of like us versus them binary, you know, he argues that Say kind of overlooks the significant economic and class dynamics that are at play, you know, both within the colonizing societies and the colonized societies.
Right, because I mean, obviously the West is not one unified thing, right? There are huge class differences. There are different political ideologies. There are all sorts of things going on within the West, and the same thing is true of the East, right?
Exactly. It's not this kind of simple like good versus evil, you know, kind of dichotomy.
Right, and so Ahmad's, you know, critique of Orientalism, it's not that he's saying that it's like a bad book or anything like that.
Right.
It's just that he's saying that we need to understand it within a broader context.
Exactly. We need to understand it within this broader context of imperialism, capitalism, class struggle, all these things.
Okay. Cool. So one other person who I know he really kind of takes on is Fredric Jameson.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, you know, Jameson's idea of third world literature functioning as national allegory.
Right.
Can you kind of explain what that idea is and how Ahmad responded to it?
Sure. So Jameson's idea of national allegory is basically that all literature from the third world can be read as this kind of allegory for the nation.
Okay.
Right. So the individual narratives and characters in these books are really kind of stand-ins for the nation as a whole.
Okay.
And Ahmad really disagreed with this.
Okay.
He argued that it was another form of homogenization. You know, it was kind of, you know, flattening all of these really diverse literary traditions, historical contexts, ideological positions, you know, flattening them all into this one category of third world literature.
Right. So it's kind of like it's taking all these different voices and all these different stories.
Right.
And it's kind of forcing them to all tell the same story, which is the story of the nation.
Exactly. And he argued that it also ignored the real diversity of like the aesthetic and political aims of writers from these parts of the world.
Right. So it's not like everyone's writing, you know, explicitly to try to like represent their nation, you know, as a whole.
Right. You know, they have their own individual concerns, their own individual artistic visions. And Jameson's framework kind of kind of ignores that.
Okay. So again, we're seeing this emphasis on the importance of like specificity and context, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's about looking at each work of literature in its own right, in its own historical context, with its own unique set of concerns.
Okay, cool. So, we've talked about how Ahmad critiques, some of the big names in postcolonial studies like Sahid and Jameson. But I think it's also important to, kind of like zoom out a little bit and think about his broader argument, right? Like how does he tie all of these things together?
Right. Yeah. So, as we've been talking about, he really emphasizes the centrality of class.
Okay.
Right. He really thinks that class needs to be this central category of analysis when we're trying to understand, national and post-colonial conditions.
Okay.
And he feels that a lot of post-colonial theorists, they kind of overemphasize cultural identities, hybridity, discourse, all of these things. And they do so at the expense of these fundamental economic realities. And for him, the nation isn't just this matter of shared culture or identity, right? It has to be analyzed through the lens of historical materialism. The specific economic structures that are in place.
Right. So again, it's about the material conditions. It's about who's controlling the resources,
Exactly.
who's benefiting from the economic system, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's about the actual like power dynamics that are shaping these societies.
Right. Okay. And I think it's also important to point out that he's not just critiquing Western scholars, right? He's also critiquing the way that the category of third world literature is constructed.
Right. Yeah, he's really critical of this idea that third world literature is this kind of like unified entity. And he argues that it ignores all of the internal diversities and contradictions, within these societies.
Right.
Including class divisions, and the fact that there are these vibrant local intellectual traditions that aren't just defined by their relationship to the West.
Right. So it's not just about, how do these societies relate to the West?
Yeah.
It's also about how they relate to themselves.
Exactly. What are the internal dynamics, the internal struggles, the internal debates that are happening within these societies?
Right. Okay. Cool. So, we've talked a lot about Ahmad's critiques, what he's against. But I think it's also important to talk about, like, what he's for, right? Like, what is he proposing as an alternative?
Yeah, so his big alternative is really a renewed engagement with Marxist analysis.
Okay.
Like, he's saying that instead of just focusing on language and representation, we need to bring material conditions, the dynamics of class struggle, the specificities of historical development, all these things, we need to bring them to the forefront of our analysis.
Right. So it's not that he's saying that culture and language are unimportant.
Right.
It's that he's saying that they're not the only things that matter.
Right, exactly. They need to be understood in relation to these broader material forces.
Okay.
And he really believes that colonialism and imperialism can't be fully understood if we're just looking at discourse.
Right.
We have to look at them through the lens of global capitalism, economic exploitation, and the class dynamics that result from that, both within the colonizing societies and the colonized societies.
Right. So he's really calling for this kind of like more holistic approach to understanding these complex phenomena.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not just about, what are people saying? It's about like what are the material conditions that are shaping what they're saying.
Right. Okay, cool. So, we've talked a lot about Ahmad's work and I think it's clear that he's offering a really kind of like radical and challenging perspective.
He is, yeah.
And his book In Theory was published back in 1992, so it's been a while.
It has, yeah.
So I'm curious, like, why do you think his work is still so relevant today?
Well, I think a big part of it is that his core challenge to the dominance of identity politics and culturalist frameworks.
Okay.
I think that challenge is still really relevant today, because, we still see this tendency, I think, in a lot of academic disciplines, to focus primarily on issues of identity and representation.
Right.
And Ahmad's work is this really important reminder that we can't forget about the material conditions. We can't forget about economic exploitation. We can't forget about class struggle, all these things that are still very much, shaping the world that we live in.
Right. So it's kind of like a corrective, right? It's pushing back against this tendency to only focus on culture and identity.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a really important counterbalance.
Okay, cool. And we're living in a world where globalization is more intense than ever, where neoliberal economic policies, are really kind of dominant in a lot of different parts of the world. So do you think that those kind of like contemporary realities make his work even more relevant?
I think so. Yeah, I think in a world where post-colonial studies can sometimes be kind of co-opted or commodified,
Okay.
or become kind of detached from the actual struggles for decolonization and economic justice.
Right.
I think Ahmad's work is this really powerful and necessary counterpoint to that. He was always advocating for this politically engaged and materially grounded approach to both literature and theory.
Right.
And I think that that's something that we really need today, is to not lose sight of the fundamental economic inequalities and power imbalances that continue to shape the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have, yeah.
We've really kind of like dug into Aijaz Ahmad's work. His background, his core ideas, his critiques of postcolonial theory, his emphasis on class, his alternative approach to understanding literature and culture.
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating discussion.
Yeah, it has. And I hope that our listeners, they've gotten a lot out of this. That they've maybe learned something new, or at least started to think about these things in a different way.
Totally. I think his work really challenges us to think differently about a lot of these really big issues.
Yeah. And, on that note, I want to leave our listeners with a kind of like a final thought, a question to kind of like ponder, as they go about their day.
Okay.
And this is something that, we've kind of touched on throughout this deep dive, but I think it's really important. So, considering Ahmad's arguments about the importance of economic structures and class dynamics, how might a focus on those factors, a focus on economic structures, class dynamics, how might that reshape our understanding of contemporary global issues?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, because so often we tend to frame these issues, primarily through the lenses of culture or identity.
Right.
But what if we were to kind of like shift our focus and really start to think about the underlying economic forces that are at play?
Yeah, I think that could be a really powerful and insightful way of approaching these issues.
Yeah, so that's something I would encourage our listeners to really kind of sit with, and think about, in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable takeaway from Ahmad's work.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the work of Aijaz Ahmad.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.
See you then.